So, I just finished uploading the first episode of the Vloggy podcast. I just finished uploading the first episode of the Poddy podcast. A title I really like, honestly. And I was sitting home alone and I figured, hey, I could do a second one. I mean, I have some time. I have a topic I would like to talk about, so why not, right? So I'm playing a bit of Trackmania again, and I would like to talk about why specifically I am such a big fan of webcomics. Because it is unusually specific interest. Because I'm not interested in comics in general, or not really at least. I used to read some comics, like a lot of Belgian Franco comics, also the Dutch Donald Ducks, but Asterix and Obelisk, Lucky Luke, Tintin, or Kuifje as he's called here. But I never had that much interest in them. At least I quite liked them. I did some stuff with it, but I wasn't as interested in them as like video games, for example. But once I came into contact with webcomics back in 2000 and what might it have been, 2011, 2012? My first webcomic was Homestuck, so it was released after 2009. But it just really grabbed me in a way that no other medium has ever done so. And there are a few reasons for this, at least so far as I can identify. The reason I personally would find the most obvious is that I'm just really into the freedom of formats that webcomics provides and the kinds of formats that webcomics are capable of. That's a difficult turn. Because there's just so much possible with formats when it comes to webcomics. You have as much freedom as you have space on the page, really, the infinite canvas, etc. And any limitations are set up by the creators themselves. Some creators want to some creators want to make sure that their work would work in a comic book format or in a comic strip format. And they format it like that, and that's their choice. But they can also break away from those formats if they want to. And some formats, of course, I find more interesting than others. And I'm quite interested. And I'm really weirdly interested in form over content for some reason. This can also be seen in some other media that I'm interested in. For example, I'm really interested in the films by Wes Anderson, because those films just do some really interesting things with the way that they present the content rather than just the content on its own. That's also kind of the case with a lot of interesting directors. So it's more about formats rather than the content, the story, rather than anything like that. So, and personally, I'm really interested, in particular, in like turbo media style webcomics and also adventure webcomics, stuff like Awful Hospital, Homestuck, Ava's Demon, Ruby Quest. Lots of stuff comes to mind. I just have a fascination with what is possible with a format, and also interesting ways in which to tell stories. Right now I am looking at a lot of really early webcomics, like 90s stuff. And some people just experimented with it in ways that you wouldn't even think of today, using 3D graphics to create really weird experimental stuff. or even just letting players decide what the story will be like. So there's a lot of potential there, and I'm just really fascinated by that. Something else, another point I would like to get to is the fact that that it's just my kind of niche, I suppose. I'm really interested in niche things in general. If you know my Wikipedia work, you probably know that I really like talking about very oddly specific things. And the idea of the niche that only a few people are really interested in is just something I have kind of obsession with, and I'm not entirely certain why that is. But that's just how I interact with media in general. Completely missed that jump. And with webcomics specifically, there's also just the idea of the auteur, really, because any given webcomic is created by pretty much one or two people with total 100% complete freedom over what they're doing, ignoring like odd exceptions where people have sponsorships or such. Like yesterday I was talking about anime and how anime studios are to at least to some degree subject to a lot of entities. They have a lot of difficulty getting enough money to create such a large scale project, and have to make sure that all of the employees will remain healthy and such. But webcomics are only created by one person. Usually, or two people, maybe three. Webcomics don't have that kind of staff problem. Basically, most webcomics these days are all funded through Patreon and through direct people just reading the stuff and liking it and giving money. And that's the only medium in which that happens. It doesn't happen in any other medium because you just have complete freedom over your own website. This allows you to create works very focused on very niche, on really the most niche things possible. I have read a webcomic which is entirely about dissociative identity disorder. Like, that's not a kind of topic that would work in any other medium because it's just too niche. It's just too few people are interested in that kind of topic. Too few people experience that kind of thing. But in webcomics you can just do that. Because you can contact literally everyone in the world who has that interest. Or at least everyone who speaks English. But you can translate stuff. Webcomics are translated. There are linguistic communities, of course. There is clear Spanish-speaking or French-speaking or, of course, Korean-speaking community of webcomic creators. But people translate webcomics. I read plenty of French webcomics in English. I missed that jump. It's a shame. Oh wow, almost managed to get back up there. So, it's even possible to create a webcomic which is really about a specific community. And it can mean a national community or an international community. And it can actually work. What also helps, of course, is that webcomics are usually hobbyist projects, which is just not the case for animated films or series, which is definitely not the case for most live-action stuff, because it just takes one person, maybe there every weekend, maybe every evening. But if it's your hobby, then it just works out. If you try to do an entire film as a hobby, it just, that's just too much work. Ooh. It's just too hard. So it's really the freest medium that I know of, in both format and content. What is also interesting for webcomics is that the medium happens to be born in the exact same year as I was born. So, or basically, at least, you can argue that webcomics were born in 1995. I was born in 1995. The entire history of webcomics takes place throughout my entire life. With video games, I feel like basically the entire history of video games was already over by the time that I was old enough to even know that they existed. Like most of it happened in the 80s, really. The video game crash, the NES, the SNES, the Nintendo Genesis stuff, early computer gaming, even most 3D stuff. Like, there was already very clear history of video gaming by the time that I was born. By the time that 3D games started to come around. And I'm kind of late to the party, I feel like. Of course, I'm also late to the party with webcomics, but I still feel like it's more my kind of community, also because it takes place entirely on the internet. Which is just my place. I pretty much live on the internet. I've done so for quite a long time. It just feels more home to me. Really, one of the most important points that I completely missed out on thus far is that webcomics give me a sense of exploration that no other medium does. Not even video games, which seems like much more of an exploratory medium in which you might feel like you're physically going through an environment, like in a JRPG or in really any kind of RPG, of course. But in webcomics, there is this digital environment. It feels like a physical place, really. Any website feels like physical places that you can visit, that you can link between through hyperlinks. You can move between. And to me, this just feels very natural to me. When I go through an archive of a webcomic and then look at the characters page or the about page, I feel like I'm actually exploring a new environment. And what also helps, and is also not really the case for most media, maybe music albums, I guess, but film DVDs kind of have this, where you can really easily move between one portion of the story and the next. Really, any given page feels like its own entity. So you can open an archive and every page has its own name, usually, which is like, that's not common. You don't have pages with their own names in traditional comics. You kind of have it with music albums, but it's just an entirely different kind of medium. So like, it feels like everything is their own entity. And for someone like me who's really interested in very specific things, the idea of every specific page having like a name or an identity, that just feels good to me. It feels like home, really. And just moving between webcomics and finding new webcomics on the internet, it just feels like exploration, way more so than video games, which feels like a proper medium, a more traditional medium, like books, really. And the last thing I had written down, which is kind of a minor point, I guess, because I've really gone through all the most important ones, is that I'm just really interested in the digital aesthetic. The digital aesthetic is, of course, found in plenty of media types. Oops, completely messed up that jump. But webcomics have this specifically, where you might have glitchy appearances, where you have pixel art going through it all around. Some webcomics just are completely made out of pixel art, like Unicorn Jelly or Kid Red or MS Paint Adventures, everything. It has this digital aesthetic that you can't find anywhere else. And some of it you can find somewhere else. Like, I really appreciate some of the pixel art you might see in Gravity Falls. Gravity Falls has some really beautiful pixel art episodes, which are really gorgeous. But it's different. It feels very virtual and digital on the World Wide Web. People do some really interesting things with webcomics. Something that came to mind earlier, which is more to do with format really than with digital comics. But something that came to mind is how Dumbing of Age, which is a webcomic that just uses web strips. It just uses newspaper strips, really. It's not particularly different from anything you may see in newspapers, other than the fact that it just keeps going. Which is also kind of a point, honestly. But it seems fairly traditional in its format, but it has one panel in every strip that has a transparent background, which is something you might not even notice when you're reading it, because it just happens to be the same background color as the background itself, which is just kind of a beigey color. But when you do notice it, I noticed it primarily because I'm using a plugin to change the background color of websites to make them darker, to make things easier to look at. Ooh, no, that's not gonna be it. When you do notice it, you feel like it just has more depth than anything that is possible in traditional comic strips, than in newspaper comic strips. And also a big difference with newspaper comic strips and webcomics, in this case webcomic strips, I suppose, is that in webcomics you have way more opportunity to keep a very long story going, because you just have a page, you have an archive that you can always access, which is just not true for newspaper comics for the most part. You can just keep the story going forever, really. So when you're looking at something, let's just say Sluggy Freelance, for example, you just have this story that goes on forever, and characters that you can... it doesn't have to explain the status of the story. It doesn't have to explain the status of the story at the start of every strip, because you can just go back one page or a few pages, or it can have a commentary in which it describes what happened thus far. You can go back as often as you want. Webcomics are very non-sequential, because you can just go back. Some web cartoonists, like Dan Shive, in their descriptions, they just link every previous page or arc in which something relevant happened. So if you forgot how we got here, then you can just go and read that. And you might end up just rereading the whole webcomic all over again, like I have done very, very many times. And you might start at a completely different place each time. I've only read it from the start like 3 times or something, but I've read it from the halfway points countless of times this far. Because you can just do that. Oh god, I hate this turn. Going so fast. So for me, there's just a lot of things I really love about webcomics. There are so many interesting, unique webcomics that just bring you into a different world in a way that no other medium can do. Like, something I've really loved about Unicorn Jelly specifically is that it literally has pages in which it just kind of describes the world. And some of those pages also kind of tie back to some of the story, and it's just very, very good world building stuff. And that's only possible because it's a webcomic. It would not really have possible in a comic book. Not like this at least, not this non-sequentially. Where you just have a hyperlink to a specific page every once in a while. It's just brilliant stuff. So I guess most of this stuff that I was talking about will probably not really make that much sense to most of the listeners here, but I figured I'd try to explain it. And I know that when you're enthusiastic about something, when you really love something, then it is often just fun to listen to it as well. So yeah, I guess that's this one. I suppose that's this episode. And I don't know how many of these I'll end up doing. I quite enjoy recording it. It's a lot of fun just playing a bit of Trackmania again. Thank you all very much for listening again, and I'll see you in the next one. I feel like I stole that from something.